Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. This is the third Argyros Happy Hour, and tonight we are joined by a man who he's something else. He's pretty extraordinary. Multi hyphenate, writer, director, musician, songwriter, speaks five languages, is trained as an architect. I could go on, but rather than do that, why don't I just introduce tonight's guest, our friend Rick Miller. Rick, are you there?
I am. Hi,
Hi,
Casey.
Rick. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you.
Very well. Well, let's start with that. The first question is always, let's see, false favorite. I believe this cocktail is called.
Indeed.
And why is this your libation of choice, Rick?
Well, I grew up sort of a traditional beer drinker from Montreal, Quebec, Canada, and recently our band, one of the band members runs, everyone has a side business, of course, especially in the arts, and he has this company called False Ox, and he makes these shrubs. He calls them shrubs. What are those? Anyway, you put them in cocktails. So I've
Mm-hmm.
become a gin guy all of a sudden. And I think gin
Okay.
is resurgent all over the world,
Yeah.
especially amongst young people. So yeah, this is a mango and lime shrub from False Ox mixed with soda and gin, and hallelujah, tastes really good on a Thursday evening.
Fabulous. Well, cheers to you, Rick. Thanks again for being with us.
Cheers.
Clink. And speaking of the resurgence of gin, our guests last week, the fabulous young men from Time for Three, they also had a gin cocktail, just a more traditional gin Ricky, which was basically the same drink as this, but without the mango essence added in, which I think makes quite a difference.
I have a bad association with the word Gin Ricky. It was something that one of my dad's annoying friends called me as a kid. Hey, Gin Ricky? It's like, no, I'm not Ricky. Ricky Schroeder is Ricky.
Uh huh.
I'm Rick.
What an unusual nickname for a family friend to give a little kid.
Gin Ricky, I know. I was like, yeah, set you on a lifetime of booze there.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks for introducing us to the false favorite. And for anyone who wants to make one at home, the recipe is going to be sent out with the email at the end of the show. Um, so, how are you, Rick? How are you doing? This is a strange time and a strange circumstance for you and I to be having this discussion. And how are you holding up?
All things considered, personally, really well, physically well, professionally, it's all gone to crap. But
Mm,
so many industries have been disrupted so thoroughly. Uh, so in, crisis opportunities, artists who are normally quite, resourceful about trying to find meaning in their times, I've found a lot of meaning in what's essentially been a slowdown, reconnect, think more carefully about how you approach people,
mm-hmm.
which is exactly what mindfulness does, which is something at my wise old age of 50, I'm trying to find some wisdom, not only in our lives, but also in this particular moment, living
Mm-hmm.
very much for this moment, not anxious about the future, even though the future can provoke a lot of anxiety. So, long answer to your question, I'm doing pretty well. My kids are doing well. We're healthy, and just trying to find a way out of this by hoping people like your audience come back to places like where you're sitting right now.
Yeah. Yeah. So, how is it affecting you as an artist? I mean, as an artist, you view everything. Your worldview is infused with kind of a creative spirit, right? And the artists that I've been fortunate enough to talk to the last couple weeks, uh, they've had sort of a different spin on what this means for them, what it means for the world, and certainly what it means for them as artists. So, how do you find yourself thinking about that right now?
Well, I guess the themes that always come up. You mentioned that I studied architecture, and I was very pleased to come at it from a very broad-based perspective, which architecture gives. It gives perspective on most things and allows you to kind of zoom in when you need to, but zoom out and see the big picture.
Mm,
And the big picture of this is, hopefully an opportunity for some of the things we've learned to improve, but also, fraught with peril that
mm,
as the stock market keeps rising, and it means some people are getting, a lot richer, and some people who suffer might suffer more. So personally, I'm always trying to find what it is I am doing in my life. And that happens to be art, which can cross over to music or theater. But for me, it's very much my job. Living is my job, and communicating with others is, there's no distinction really between what I do on stage and off stage. So if anyone saw Boom that I performed at the Argyros last year, the talkback is just as important to me as the show, because it's this trying to figure out what we're all in this for and where we're going. So I've been gathering a lot of perspective, especially on part three of that trilogy, which I'm writing now for next year, because it goes all the way to 2020. So I've been using this the way artists do, opportunistically, to research, talk to people, to get a good ending to my play, so that hopefully we're in a position to use theater for what theater can give you that Netflix can't. And that includes live performance as well. But what is it? It's a sense of, this is happening in the moment. There's no pre-recorded idea happening. There's nothing being exchanged that is not real. And also the people breathing in the room, although that may be infused with droplets these days, is actually what makes uh, connection important in theater. So the two things theater is important for is exactly what we can't do right now, which is
Yeah.
physical connection and living in the present in each other's company. So I'm just really gathering all my steam, trying to use this time, be patient with myself,
Mm.
but also to be angry when it's time to be angry, and to let
Yeah.
things just happen, because it's a frustrating time for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, I think you really hit the nail on the head there, Rick, in terms of, what has been taken away from the performing arts community right now. And I think we're all, we're struggling with this conflict between hope and optimism and courage, and then just also a sense of just tragic realism about what's happening around us and what will probably continue to happen for at least some time longer. And one of the things I think that makes Boom a piece that people really connect to is that zoom in, zoom out quality that you talked about, right? I mean, on the one hand, it's very, very wide angle aperture. I mean, you're talking, it's decades in the making, and lots of different characters, and broad historical events. And then there are these tiny, tiny little, very, very intimate details of your life, your family's life, your background, and how your family ended up in Canada, et cetera. Do you feel yourself looking at this crisis, this current global emergency, also through a sort of zoom in, zoom out perspective?
Yeah, it's interesting. My daughter is 17 right now, and she, of course, is feeling that there's going to be no graduation. So she's feeling the frustration in some ways that a lot of people of different ages are feeling, based on what plateau they are in life, what stage they're at. And I also said to her that, you might be the one year everyone remembers, 20 years down the road, you're the COVID class or whatever it is.
Right.
So there are always ways to spin a half full, half empty scenario on everything. I tend to be a hopeful person by nature. I want my shows, which are reflections of myself, my solo shows anyway, to reflect hope, but also a certain amount of skepticism and inquiry. And I think we really need both at all times. It's crazy making to live that way, and yet that's life, right? Our brains are these crazy places with ideas that are often not even our own, floating around. How do we actually function and convey hope to the next generation?
Mm.
So you mentioned Boom. Boom is about, yes, 1945 to 69. It's about my parents' generation. Boom X, the sequel, was my generation, Generation X, and I maybe you're in that world too, Gen X. Part three, and all these parts are about now. It's not about nostalgia. It's not about living in the past. That really doesn't interest to me in as much as it informs where we're going and how we can actually, despite all evidence to the contrary, actually continue to make a better world. And we are. If you look at most of the metrics, most of the statistics, I know we're in pretty dire straits right now, but overall, all of the indicators show
Hmm.
that we're actually better off now than we were.
Hmm.
Young people are anxious. My daughter recently said that she doesn't think she wants to have a kid in this world. And,
Hmm.
I know a lot of millennials are also feeling they'll never be able to afford a house. Whatever the angst is, it's not new. Young people feel this a lot. What is new is that we need to, as a society, listen to each other, maybe not judge each other quite so harshly, and try to understand where we come from so that we can build something. And that's where architecture comes in handy. I feel I build things that are bridge making and not walls,
Yeah,
in a very simple analogy.
yeah. You mentioned your daughter who's 17, and will be going to university someday. Would it be this year or next year that she's
This
leaving?
year, actually, so
This year.
she's turning
Wow.
18 and she's going to start first year nursing
Yeah.
in Ottawa.
So there's a family across the street from us, and there's a young girl who's graduating high school this spring, graduating from the high school that I graduated from. And
Mhm,
it's so odd for me to look at what's happening in her life right now, and her summer of her senior year, and the kids aren't really partying, and when they do, there's a whole different sort of set of considerations around what that means. And she's an artistic girl. She does a lot of theater at her school, and I wonder what it's like for anyone coming out in this environment, but particularly for someone who's had their ambition set on a career in the arts.
mm,
And you've had so much success in your career. You've been doing it for such a long time. You've reinvented yourself and your work on so many occasions. What advice, I mean, this is kind of a softball question that you guys get all the time, but I do think it's a little bit more pointed in this current climate. What advice would you give to someone who's 17 or 18 coming out of high school, or 2021 coming out of college, and this is something that they've had their heart set on for a long time, and now they're faced with this
mhm.
much more frightening and unsecure world?
Well, if someone wants to be an actor in particular, this is through the pandemic or not, I always ask why, because I think it's good to ask ourselves why we want to do things and to question those motives. I talk about failure and the need to fail. I think anyone in science or sports or any other performative field, science isn't performative, but it follows the scientific method of failure and learning from each step. The same with the arts. If you're accepting a failure each day, in each stage of the process, and you look at the long term of a career of making things, uh, and you're not interested in being rich or famous, then if it's truly all you are called to do, then it's the best field in the world. There's nothing like embodying the human spirit, and there's nothing in particular like making your own work. And that's another thing I tell young people, especially now. Find ways to use this time to edit video, learn how to edit sound, learn how to program, learn how
Hmm.
to do everything yourself, not
Yeah.
because we're in this alone, but because it gives you skills that make you not make you maintain control and not be as dependent on the skills of others. That doesn't mean it's not a collective endeavor, but if you are able to, as I learned early in my career, to be a bit of a hack at a lot of different things, it means that you can do a lot of the groundwork yourself. It costs less, and it
Mm-hmm.
allows you then to collaborate more deeply on not just the boring programming parts, but the design and the
Mm.
artistic parts. So I
Right.
tell them, learn skills. If you're stuck, it's normal. It's good. You feel like you're failing. You feel like you have nothing to say that the great ones haven't said already. You haven't said it, and maybe you have a new take that could change someone's life. So whether you're performing for 10 people on Zoom or, you know, 20,000 people in Vegas or wherever, there's always the ability to change someone, hopefully for the better. And I'd say hold on to that and have a long-term patience with this
Mhm.
crazy making career.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're speaking to there, Rick, is the power of an artist and a performing artist in particular to connect with an audience, with an audience at large, or even just with a single individual within a larger audience. And because the audience experience has been so radically broken and transformed by this, I mean, it'll come back. I don't think anyone is really concerned about that, but it is upside down at the moment, and I wonder how artists are recalibrating their connection with their audiences right now. I mean, it's you have to find new ways to connect with people. And part of that is that sort of DIY bootstrap ethos that you mentioned. And I think it's really interesting because that's become kind of a recurring theme on these happy hour conversations. But what are you doing to connect with audiences in this new climate?
Well, I was pretty slow to jump to all of a sudden. I don't know, I'm very careful with my what I put out in the world, which makes me a really bad social media user,
Mhm.
which is all about here's what I feel now.
Right.
I take a long time to write my shows, and my shows are generally distillations of what I'd like to communicate into the world. So I've been slow, very cautious, maybe too cautious, watching what other people do, not particularly loving any performance on Zoom. However, acknowledging that this is a temporary uh, potential for innovation. And I'm watching artists, many artists, especially young people who are just so they just thrive on disruption sometimes, and they're just finding ways to survive and create really interesting things. So an example, I have a band, a party band, a neighborhood band here that we play a lot of fundraisers, and we're a 10-piece band. So it's like my E Street band. I get to not be alone on stage, and
Mhm.
my wife's in it, my neighbors are in it. I'm looking out my window now. Half the band is basically across a porch. We can't play. Our neighborhood wants music, but we can't do it.
Mhm.
So we recorded this little we realized too, we have the ability to raise money. I have a very small platform, but I have a platform and I have the ability to edit video
Mhm.
uh, quite well. So I spent a while gathering video from everyone. I put together the Zoom, everyone in their living room shot, and our cover of heroes raised for local food bank just raised $6,000 just based on people sharing it. So I realized I can do things. I can do a lot of good. I'm in no rush to digitize all of my shows and put them out online.
Yeah.
Uh, However, there's a new service called Broadway On Demand. They've approached us to put our theater for young audiences shows out there. So Jungle Book, which they had a tour that was canceled, it was going everywhere. Our 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. These are all really great multimedia shows that I've developed with my partner and my company. They're now not touring, and all these artists are suffering. Can we, show the archival video, which is a good video, one Saturday for families online? Sure, no one's getting paid. It's all it's all for people to do something. So it's a stopgap. I
Yeah.
guess everything is stopgap until I can get back in the room with you and
Yeah.
with your audience. That's what I live for, and I think it will happen, as you know. But the reports the last few days have been more and more, I guess, conservative. They're saying there might not be any theater season next year for a lot of theaters, and I
Mhm.
don't know how it is out in Idaho, but in hot spots like Toronto, Montreal, New York, they're saying there's probably not going to be anything for quite a long time.
Yeah, I mean it's going to vary from place to place, region to region, and also just individual to individual. Part of it is going to be determined by a person's temperament. You mentioned some of the video work you've been doing, and I think Sam, we've got a short clip to share. Yeah, is that about
Yeah,
ready to go? Okay,
there's a
so
cover
thanks for
of David Bowie's Heroes, just to give it context. That's all.
okay, thanks for bringing this with you today, Rick.
Thanks. This is our band Trainwreck because we're loud.
Make their lives a little bit better. Love one another. A little bit more. Yeah! We can be heroes just for one day. Yeah! We can be heroes.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So Rick, can you walk us through what it's like to make one of those videos? Because I think that there's a little bit of a sleight of hand that goes on there that people watching them don't really understand the amount of work that goes into making something like that. I mean, it kind of looks like you guys are all just jamming in your living rooms, but that's not really what's happening, is it?
I laugh only because it's a hell of a lot of work, and it's
Yeah.
a bit of a nightmare sometimes trying to get everyone in their own, even just to gather the video is one thing.
Yeah.
So I needed to record something, and the way it works is if you record something on a very clear click track or very clear tempo, and everyone is working off of that, that means when they send me their videos, I have a very easy reference point to edit them all together. if everyone's just saying, just play the song the way you'd play it live, it would be an absolute disaster.
Right.
So you don't see any live Zoom performances, usually even when they look live, because of the sound latency. It's
Hmm.
annoying. This way, people can record something more or less in a controlled way, and the editor, who is in this case me, can edit it, sync things up. If someone made a mistake on one bar, I can cheat and steal a bar from somewhere else.
Hmm.
So it's an absolute, puppet master
Yeah.
scenario, and it takes a lot of time, but I love editing video. I really enjoy um, the process of putting things together it's like architecture, right? You're building something that has a certain aesthetic and emotional effect on people. And I love the act of doing it. If I didn't like editing video, there's no way I'd go through the, probably 50 hours of putting that thing together.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I mean, I really love hearing about that because I think it speaks to two things. One is sort of, the latency in the internet that you mentioned, but the other is like just how subtle it is when musicians are playing together when they are in the same room, in the same space, and the amount of sort of like, I mean, it's hundredths of a second, that your ear is picking up and that you're playing and that your band is all sort of, and that's where a lot of the magic of live performance comes from, is that, that sense of nuance. And as fun as some of these quarantine recordings are, we haven't figured out how to capture that yet. That we haven't cracked that atom quite yet.
Yeah, you had a musician in your series as well earlier, and I've I've just spoken to a lot of musicians who are far better musicians than I am, often jazz musicians, and jazz is all about just listening and being loose, and you simply can't be loose, and you can't listen. Frankly, you can't. You can listen, but you can't respond. There's
Mhm.
no active listening in that sense.
Yeah,
So it's very frustrating for a lot of people to work on a metronome or a click track, and
yeah,
that's just, again, it's stopgap. It's the way it is. It will actually produce some memorable content, and we will remember these years for some of the people who did remarkable things.
yeah,
And I'm thinking of some good news, and whatever John is doing out there.
yeah,
There are people doing great things. I just always worry that we will lose yet even more of a fragile audience base. And maybe my worry is not founded. Maybe people will be flocking to see live performance again. Uh, but I don't know if you share that worry, Casey. I always do, that the audience is getting older. Maybe younger people don't have the interest, the discretionary income. I don't know.
yeah. No, I think we're all worrying about that. I mean, it's such a the economics of the performing arts world are so fragile to begin with. And then having to kind of shoulder something like this is a real challenge. And but I think like you, I mean, I'm sort of maybe pessimist near term, optimist long term.
Yeah.
And the good news there is that the learning that's going to take place between here and there is going to, something interesting and possibly even remarkable is going to come out of it, and we all just have to kind of like hang in there together. So we've started getting some questions. I don't know if they're popping up on your screen, but here's one. Rick, we
No.
loved Boom at the Argyros, where you depict many characters throughout the performance. Which character do you enjoy the most to depict? Do you find yourself being connected to one figure more than others?
Uh, yes, that's Michael. Okay, so I particularly love in 1965 playing Barry McGuire's Eve of Destruction. I wasn't alive. I was only born in 1970. However, that song I know was the first protest song to reach number one on the pop charts.
Mm,
And Barry McGuire sings with the Eastern word. He sings with this raunchy voice about the eve of destruction. It's not a happy song,
mm,
and yet the amazing thing about rock and roll, and that's a folk song turned into rock, is you can sing about the most tragic things and yet have a great time doing it and be so exuberant. So I love that song, especially because I also manipulate the audience into wanting the chorus. And as soon as the chorus comes, I stop and I do the Pillsbury Doughboy, which is a very frustrating thing for some people. But I bring the chorus in at the end of the year, and I keep my guitar and harmonica on. So I love doing that because of the resonance that a lot of people have with that song.
mhm.
Not everyone knows it. It's not, the Beatles, All My Loving, but it is a gem. And in part three of my third part of the trilogy, Boom YZ, it is one of my three final songs that the audience will choose based on an app: dystopia, utopia, or status quo. It's the dystopia. It's the song I will sing in a very slightly different way again if people choose that, because every word in that song about how messed up the world potentially is still potentially relevant today.
Yeah. Well, I know a little bit about this because you and I have discussed it previously, but so we have Boom and Boom X and Boom YZ or YZ.
In
Um,
Canada.
yeah, is you're still in the late stages of completing that, right?
Yes, it's
So,
premiering next March, so we're working on it now.
okay, do you think, given this kind of tectonic event that's happened in the last 10, 12 weeks, that you'll be looking at, doing something in Boom YZ, making some sort of reference to COVID?
Oh yeah, the play ends in 2020, and in some ways, this has given me such a. It starts the series starts with the end of World War II and the bombing in Japan,
Hmm.
and part one ends with the moon landing, and so in some ways, it's given me a very important historical moment where the
Yeah.
world was sort of sitting on the chance to change things potentially for the better very quickly,
Mm.
or to continue potentially on a road that isn't so positive. So I feel that the opportunity that this pandemic has presented us has unified the world, that we're dealing with the same thing. It's a very small thing, but it's the same, even more than a world war in some sense, which was fighting an enemy, a country against each other. This is a virus. So I feel that I've been given a perfect opportunity to kind of have that button moment, the way the
Yeah.
moon landing ended Boom.
Yeah, I mean that's really a nice kind of hopeful way to frame the issue. Uh, we had Isabella Boylston, the ABT principal dancer, on a few weeks ago, and one of the things I asked her is, what silver linings have you found through all of this? And I loved her answer. She said, well, I'm talking to my mom a lot more. And I've been talking to my mom a lot more as well. He's probably watching. Hi, mom. So so what silver linings have you found?
Well, I turned 50 just this past March. Actually, right when the pandemic hit a certain stage was my 50th birthday, and I made a resolution to try to be more wise. I think I hinted at this earlier. And what does being more wise mean? It sounds a bit like all of a sudden I'm get all new agey and start doing
Hmm.
more yoga. But I'm doing more yoga, and
Hmm.
I'm actually being mindful. And again, I know this is privilege speaking, but I think the act of stopping and of keeping a social distance with people, and of being alone and at home inside our heads, gives us an incredible opportunity to try to understand our mind. And I feel that the mind is, even the mom that we call every day, the mind is with us at all times and will be with us until our last breath. And so we have this opportunity to not just work out our bodies if we can, if we're
Hmm.
in a position to do that, but to actually understand and train the mind so that we are less manipulated, deceived, and frankly not owned, but coerced, influenced, and so prone to judgment all the
Hmm.
time. So it's given me an opportunity to be a little less reactive, and that's why I
Hmm.
didn't want to rush into creating stuff for COVID. I wanted to be
Yeah.
more careful, because I think it's exactly what mindfulness is trying to teach me anyway, is to be more in the present. Do not be as reactive. Don't. It's a bit like a Jedi thing. I grew up with Star Wars, right? It's
Mhm.
be the Jedi, right?
Yeah.
Don't lead with your emotions all the time.
Um, yeah, I think I just kind of like processing that through, my worldview, right? I think as artists, it's hard to be deprived as artists or arts providers. In our case here at the Argyros, it's hard to be deprived of this act of congregation, the act of assembly, right? Because that's what so much of it relies upon. But there is something and yes, this is coming from a place of fortune and privilege, and there are wretched things happening right now to a heartbreaking number of people, but there is something kind of purifying about distance, and there are lots of kind of spiritual traditions, I think, where that's observed, in silence and sort of no touching and chastity and all of these things that are not really part of our contemporary worldview, and some of it is being forced upon us right now, and maybe a I don't know, maybe a new sort of collective vision or collective spirit will emerge from that.
I think you're absolutely right. I think when artists have it too easy, the art isn't as good. It's not that you need to be miserable to write a good song. However, I think creativity comes from constraints,
Hmm.
and you need to impose constraints. You can't have an unlimited budget. You can't write a show about everything, even though I sometimes try to do that. It
Yeah.
never works well. So I think the constraints that we're feeling, the fact that we're all feeling a bit confined, is going to lead to some of the most remarkable art at the end of all this, maybe in a couple of years. So I'm trying to use that as positive energy and to really kind of dig into, why am I so uncomfortable? Why am I so restless? Why am I so anxious?
Hmm.
And to actually present that on stage in a way, not through a collective therapy session, but
Yeah.
to identify that and to translate it into what I create, so that we can all not lose sight of the big picture when we're freaking out in the moment.
Right. So in addition to our Q&A feed, some nice folks submitted questions in advance. I'm going to pull out some of these now. Um, can you tell us a little bit about your creative process?
Yeah,
That's an easy one, huh, Rick?
well, I guess judging from my architecture training, I still follow the same process. Every show, even when it's a kid show that I'm directing and not in, has the same start with me. I start reading a lot. I draw. I do a lot of sketches. I'd show you my sketchbooks, but I don't have any right now. When I was an architecture student, I was told to just make notes, draw, collect like a scrapbook, and sketch. Sometimes when your brain is stuck, the hand can free up certain ideas. So I use my architecture degree to draw, and also then to look at what I've drawn, to start seeing what that might look at on a stage in
Mhm.
terms of a stage machine. And then the ideas that I've been reading in the books start to match up with the form that I've been creating in my sketchbooks.
Hmm.
And of course, this is collaborative. It's not just me in my head. I work usually in workshops where, we're talking, maybe a workshop one day I'll do it over there, where I work
Mhm.
for a week on a new project. We present it in a work in progress stage for an invited audience, so that people are led into the process. The only trick is they have to give me their honest feedback.
Mhm.
And then I move to the next step. And usually it takes about 2 years to go from an idea to something I'm comfortable to present to a paid audience.
Well, that's kind of a tee up for the next submitted question that we got, which is, what are you working on right now?
Right now, well, we had a whole bunch of stuff canceled, of course. I was supposed to be in Taiwan this week with my Asian premiere of Boom. Boom X Part 2 was supposed to play in French in France. Uh, so I was supposed to be working on those things, and it would have been a really, really busy
Mhm.
May. So things have been a little more casual since then. But I was also working on a Frankenstein premiere in the fall. That's in the Theater for Young Audiences trilogy of shows that we make. That's been canceled, or at least postponed. Uh, However, I am still working on Boom YZ,
Mhm.
YZ, uh, because the premiere is in March, and it looks like March of next year things might still function where the show is going to
Mhm.
premiere in Canada. So I'm actively processing, mostly in intake mode right now, and slowly creating content for that show, which, like Boom, is going to be a 25-year multimedia collage
Yep.
of what those years represent and hopefully point us forward.
And lots of different characters and lots of music,
Yeah,
same sort
you
of
know,
same aesthetic.
music, culture, politics, news clips. This is the era of the internet.
Mhm.
Uh, YouTube, and it's also not through my eyes necessarily. In this case, Boom was me talking to my mother. In this case, I'm talking to my daughter.
Mm,
So she's not representative of a generation, but she is going to be the voice of certain young people and their anxieties. The hope, as always, is to try to get away from the okay boomer sort of and the vice versa judgments that
right.
happen. We all call the younger generation entitled. They're, this and that. This
Yeah.
always happens. And there's a larger, more complex story to be told.
Sure.
And my play offers an opportunity for me to speak to a lot of people, to try to bring their voices into my show so that we can try to understand each other a little bit better without, shooting back on Twitter
Yeah.
immediately.
So Joanne asks, and back in my filmmaking days, I used to hate getting this question because I always thought the answer was, well, my whole life. But she said, how long did it take you to create the show Boom?
Uh, 3 years. That one took 3 years from an initial idea where I was starting with the 1960s because it's this mythical decade that I didn't live through, and I wanted to know what happened. And then it evolved. I realized I couldn't tell the story of rock and roll without digging into the politics and the technology, and that brought me further and further back to the start of that generation, which was the baby boom. So, and then I had to push it beyond that to the moon landing because that encapsulated 25 years that I thought were the coming of age of a generation. So all that thinking, all that process, working with my collaborators took 3 years. The set design took about 3 minutes. We really and it doesn't mean the set is not simple. It's just a very elegant cylinder
Yeah.
that was a time capsule that I drew in my sketchbook, and my designer had drawn something similar when I mentioned a rocket. And we realized there's our set. Let's now fill it up with crap.
Hmm. And how is the set for, and no trade secrets, but how's the set for YZ different? I mean, I imagine there's got to be something more sort of fragmented about it, right? Because that would reflect the current era.
Yes. So I'll stop by X because Generation X, the circle turned into a diamond. Baseball is a bit of a metaphor because it's also the age of my baseball team, which are the Montreal Expos.
Hmm.
Rest in peace. But
Hmm.
baseball was a big sport in my life, and I use the metaphor of failure in baseball as a kind of catalyst for, in a way, the failure of Gen X, or to at least explore that idea. So I take the circle, the cylinder, I turn it into an X, and I also come out of that X. So it kind of breaks it open into more jagged planes
Hmm.
because it was an era of polarization, not just punk and disco, but also conservative and progressive really started driving wedges into each other. And we now live in the outcome of what started in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So Boom YZ, the set is not circles or diamonds, but it's filters, it's planes, it's a bunch of screens that look like giant monoliths or iPhones
Hmm.
that I can either go behind or in front of. And in theaters that will allow me to do it, they will also fly, they will move. The set is way more fluid, like the internet. And
Yeah.
that's the concept.
You mentioned the sort of the recent history of polarization, political polarization, and I don't think it's at all impolite at this point to say that this pandemic in the U.S. at least has become kind of a political issue. And making no further commentary on that other than to say I think that caught some people off guard. Has there been a similar phenomenon along those lines taking place in Canada?
Yes and no. Things are never quite as extreme as they are in the States, but we have the same pulls to the right, we have the same pulls to the left, the same refusal to listen to extremes because they're extreme. And so, yeah, but however, our prime minister has been pretty measured in all of this and
Hmm.
has gained a lot of people's respect begrudgingly, people who didn't like him. He is the son of the prime minister who comes at the end of Boom, so he's Trudeau, and he came at it with a lot of love, I think, and love being something that he speaks about pretty openly. Love,
Hmm.
compassion, caring, and that's not just a Canadian thing. It's just how he's approached this, and people have listened to him because he's been quiet. He hasn't blurted too
Hmm.
much. He had one moment that became a meme. He talked about speaking moistly about wearing masks, and it became an internet meme. But other than that, he hasn't screwed up at all.
Yeah.
Uh, Provincially, we have the same polarization, except it's not quite as this conflict. I'm sorry, this pandemic has not quite exacerbated the conflict the way I think it has in the U.S. And I think we've pulled together pretty well as a country.
Hmm.
People are listening to each other, and again, listening is so key and so hard to do these days because of so much information coming at us. Even the conservative premier, the head of our province, who I don't like because he's a populist and he's a loudmouth, but I find he's been respectful because he's actually listening and speaking quietly. And in an era where everything is amplified by social media, it's nice to hear quiet, reasonable voices paying attention and respecting science. And that is incredibly important in
Hmm.
our country, is that the right to respect when experts speak, especially about science and medical issues, which I don't think, anyway, there's a whole current of disrespect and distrust of science that I think is really dangerous in the world right now.
Yeah. Well, Rick, I've really enjoyed listening to you this evening, and I'm sure all of our friends and audience members who joined us tonight enjoyed listening as well. Um, Probably wrap up pretty quickly here. Do you have any kind of closing thoughts for us before we sign off this evening?
Well, I mean, in the spirit of, if I were speaking to all of your audience right now in a talk back, I would ask them about, their younger generation, because often the audiences are older. And I would encourage you to use this time just to ask each other better questions.
Mm.
If you feel you've heard all the same answers of your parents or your kids or your grandparents, use the time to talk and listen while we have this time, and listen better. I've become a much better listener since I've shut up for a little bit. And I
Mm.
know I've talked a lot at you, Casey, but such is the medium. I really I stay quiet most of the day, and I listen, and I especially listen to my kids, and I don't just
Hmm.
judge them for being on their screens too often, which
Hmm.
they are.
Hmm. Well, it's hard not to listen to my kids when they're 3 and 1 and they're just screaming at the top of their lungs half the day. So, but I love them. I love you, boys. Rick, thanks again. You're a gentleman and a scholar, and we love you here at the Argyros. We do look forward to welcoming you back one of these days and screening more of your fantastic work here. You got a lot of fans here at the Argyros in the Wood River Valley, and appreciate spending a little time with you this evening. So thanks again. Thanks so
Thank you
much.
so much. I had such a lovely time, and I hope to come back. Cheers to all of you.
All right. Cheers. Thanks, Rick.
Bye-bye.
So let's hold on just one sec, Sam. I'll just sign off. This was the third of our 3 Argyros happy hours, and we were very pleased to have Isabella Boylston, Time for 3, and Rick Miller, some of our favorite artists from different performing arts genres and disciplines: dance, music, theater. And, obviously we're looking into additional ways and alternative ways that we can bring programs to you at this time. And we look forward to making some of those announcements in the very near future. Until then, thanks again for joining us for this series of Argyros Happy Hours. Everyone stay safe and stay well, and everyone take care. Thanks.